Well, 15 minutes. That's the timer. Okay, so thank you all for being here. My essay is about monetary theory and policy in the Soviet Union. I first want to share with you why I chose this topic to present today. What interests me is the socialist transition that for me is not like a defined mode of production with its own laws, as for example Prorashensky thought. Prorashensky in Soviet Russia thought that the socialist transition was like a mode of production guided by a law of planning. But for me, the socialist transition is more like a social economic form in flux, dynamic, in between capitalism and socialism. So it doesn't have just one law or one regulator. You have effectively the law of plan, but you also have the laws that come from capitalism, from the world of necessity. So you also have in motion the law of value, and with the law of value, obviously, the need for money in that economy. And the other important regulator for me in the socialist transition must be who has power. So the other aspect of the thing is which social class is effectively empowered in that society. So I want to bring some aspects of the monetary discussions in Soviet Russia from 1917 to 1924. It's a selected period, of course, but it's a very, very long history. To start, I want to point out some data from before the revolution, from the First World War. War was very difficult for the Tsarist Russia, right? The Tsarist state wasn't ready to be part of a big world war, so they had to finance it, mainly the war deficit, by monetary expansion and by debt. So the state started printing paper money, a lot of paper money, that changed the rules, as Samuel just told us. It's other rules for having gold rubles than for having paper money printed by the bank. But as you can see, the state started emitting money at a rate of 17% or 19%, but it didn't translate automatically into those rates of inflation. And this is important because Marx was a very big critique of the quantitative theory of money, that thinks that if you print money at a 10% rate, prices should increase also at a 10% rate. This doesn't hold empirically, and I think it was because paper money was just appearing in Soviet Russia, so the society hadn't yet made an experience with paper money. It's more complex than that, but for the peasants, if the bill said this is worth 1 gold ruble, okay, it's worth 1 gold ruble, and I will believe the Tsar that signs the bill, and I will take it from a 1 gold ruble. So in the first years of this enormous emission of paper money, there was almost no inflation in Russia, so the Tsarist government could finance itself by printing a lot of papers in the economy. But I want you to look at the 1916 and 1917 figures, because that's where things started to change. In 1917, the bourgeois provisional government started financing almost exclusively the war effort with money printing, and then this started to shift, and inflation started to become greater than the initial emissions of paper money. And this is a very big problem because it relates to one of the issues that Marx brings up in Capital, that state can print paper money, but state cannot create value by printing paper money. Once the state prints paper money, it sends it to society, and it's society who determines the value of those papers. So what's happening in 1917 is that the state is losing its power to finance itself by paper money, because that money is increasingly less valuable than before. You have to print really enormous amounts of money but because of the rate of inflation is so much greater than the money being printed, those new prints of money are even more or less valuable. So, having said that, I'm going to make a mortal leap and go to one of the first crises of Soviet Russia I want to bring up. That's war communism. 1918, it started in 1918. Soviet workers' Russia had two problems in 1918. They have to win a civil war and an imperialist war, and they also needed to get food for the workers. I want to bring this up because Soviet revolution put the land in the hands of the peasants. So one of the most important resources in an economy, food, needed to feed the workers, needed to feed the Red Army to win the war, was not socially produced by state companies. Food was produced by peasants. And peasants in Russia were like a mixed class, because they were for one part were producers for self-consumption. So from that point of view, they didn't enter social metabolism, they enter individual metabolism. They produced to eat for the family. But by the other hand, they produced what was left for the market. So they entered marginally the social metabolism of society. But what's important here is that the workers, in order to get food, they needed to get that from the peasants. So that's how to get food. It's a social problem. It's not a technical problem. It's a question of how do we organize this society, organized this way. In capitalism, it's easy. If you want to buy food, you have to have money. And money is the concrete representation of value, of social labor. Lenin, in 1918, he said, what the workers really need is like a credit line with the peasants. What we need is that the peasants understand that we need to win the war in order for them to keep the lands. So what we need from them is that they lend us food, and we are giving them these papers. It was called the Sovnaks, the Soviet ruble. We need to give them these papers, and they have to give us food so we can win the war. But one of the lessons of the 20th century, I think, is that these like political or moral incentives to produce only functions in a small vanguard of society. You cannot command labor by political or moral prompts in the socialist transition, because you are not already in communism, where maybe one member of society gives the society what he can and takes what he needs. That's communism. In the transition to communism, you still need a law of value. You still need a law of value. You still need an economic and material incentive in order to produce. So the Soviets needed to buy the peasants' food. The peasants won't give the Soviets the food for free, so they need to buy it. And the Bolsheviks were about sound money. They didn't believe in inflation. But they have no other choice. They have no means to finance themselves. The state companies weren't profitable, so they needed to print money to buy food for the peasants. So they started to print enormous amounts of money. See at this rate of emission, 1,400% per year. It's a lot of money printing. In 1921, the Moscow printing industry was the biggest industry in the country. It was functioning day and night. They were printing money. And okay, they started buying the peasants' food this way. What's the problem? The peasants didn't know. They thought, okay, it says one gold ruble, it's one gold ruble. But they stopped to believe in that. So the peasants start refusing to sell to the Soviets at those rates of inflation. So, whoa, time is flying. Okay. And we just to cut a little bit. So war communism was about, okay, we can't buy food from the peasants, so we have to take food from the peasants. The requisitions started. Requisitions means that if you are a family of 4, we leave you with 4 potatoes and we take the rest. If you produce 20, we took 16. If you produce 10, we take 6. If you produce 4, we can take nothing. That's a very anti-economic form of production because it has no material incentives. So peasants started to stop growing crops. There was even a law that even passed that it was intended to force the peasants to grow crops. Like, okay, that has nothing to do with social revolution. So this law passed, but then the Soviets decided to start buying the peasants' food and start charging a tax instead of these requisitions. The problem that's what as the Soviets take the food from the peasants, commodities stopped flowing in Soviet Russia. So there was even less and less commodities. So you have an enormous amount of paper money, but less commodities. So paper money hadn't had a space to circulate. So if paper money hasn't had a place to circulate, prices grow even more. Because society needs the money that it needs to circulate. If you reduce the market sphere of society, money has no place to circulate and it grows, inflation goes up and up and up and up. And you can see that production, because of the war and civil war and war communism, really dropped in 1920s and 1921s. It was really disaster. So I want to bring up this problem, and I'm finishing because I don't have much time. The question was, how do you plan in an economy with those rates of inflation? And that wasn't an easy question to make, because in order to plan, you have to have a sound measure of value. It's very difficult to plan if not. What was happening to the Bolsheviks is that maybe the Commissar of Education, he drafted a budget, but by the time the Commissar of Education finished drafting the budget, it wasn't actual, it wasn't current. And by the time the Soviets approved that budget, they needed a ton more of money in order to function. So planning in war communism stopped being economic planning, saying where we can invest, what's the best way of producing, but planning became, okay, we need 1 trillion rubles, so you go print 1 million rubles and we'll get those rubles on a train and we'll send the train to St. Petersburg where they need the money. That's not economic planning. That's not a better mode of production than capitalism. So the Soviets needed some measure of value. And you can tell me, okay, you don't need money, you could fix prices. Okay, the Soviets were idiots. They obviously fixed prices. But they also were idiots and they were doing these statistics based on their price fixed. So the price of bread was 10 rubles, but the real price of bread was 10 million rubles. So the statistics were with 10 million rubles, obviously. Okay, price fixing doesn't hold up because value is a social relationship. You can't decree the value of a good. It's obvious that but it was a discussion in Soviet Russia. So the other experiment they came up with was from Preobrazhensky actually. He said, okay, we'll take the prices before the war. We go to the supermarket, 1913, we take a picture of those prices, and we adjust them by inflation. That's also a problem, because value reflects current social relationships in a country. Value, what reflects is how much effort a society needs to put on producing some good at some given time. If you take the values of 1913, it's like you're planning for another society. It's like if we are planning for Mars. It has nothing to do with rational plan if you take prices from another year. Other comrades came up with another idea that was to create an indexed ruble. Indexed means adjust by inflation. So you take the inflation rate and you adjust the current price and you convert it in a standard, a sound measure of value. But the problem with that is that it works when you want to fix one price. You can't index, for example, rent prices. Okay, if the rent is 100 rubles and inflation is 10%, okay, if the rent is 110 rubles. But you can't fix with an indexation all prices of economy. It's a mathematical problem. When all prices of economy are indexed, automatically you cannot calculate the next index number. And I like this example because it shows up how a social problem can never be resolved by a technical matter. It's not like it fails because it's mathematically impossible. It fails because having a sound measure of value is a social problem, and you can resolve it by taking into account an index and bringing it to our days, and I'm finishing. You can resolve it also by resorting to an Excel table. You can solve it taking into account its artificial intelligence or algorithms, because it's a complex social problem and not a technical problem. So, okay, 50 minutes, it's very tight time. I didn't have time to say anything, so I will leave it here and I will retake at the question. Thank you.